Hello everyone, Hafsa here. And this is the final lesson in the animation production sections. Basically, after this, you're going to have your complete animation. This is also the last step in the animation pipeline, at least on the production side of things, and this is the compositing. This part is very technical, and it's highly dependent on which software you're using. In fact, one of the biggest changes between different animation software are the compositing features that they have in them. In that department, the iPad is somewhat lacking, and it's pretty much less effective than some other software that you have on the market, especially in computer softwares. But I will be showing you how you can make some different approaches and use different softwares and different ways to composite your animation using the iPad. This type of animation techniques will work for every software that you try, as long as you have your layer modes and the clipping mask. And actually, one of the bigger reasons why I use Flip-a-Clip as my go-to animation software on the iPad is because it does have some compositing features built in. But even so, sometimes you want to have something more serious for your compositing, in which case I will be using Procreate. And I will be showing you how to composite using both of them, as well as how to export and import between them. If you're using a different software with this video, that's still fine. You can follow along with your own features in your own software. And if you have some automatic features, then that's all the better for you. Still, it's good to know how these things works, so you can create them in any type of software, even if you don't have automatic features. Let us begin! First, let's talk about what is compositing exactly. So, the compositing stage in production is where you put all of the shot's elements together to create your final image for each frame. In this stage, you make sure that everything works together and that it looks like it's really part of the same environment. This is usually where you're going to add your parallax effect and your camera movement if you have a software with automatic features, which allows for built-in camera movement. But for our purposes, this is going to be the place where we're only adding the lighting, as well as compositing any overlays that we need to have in the environment, depending on which type of scenes we're having. Compositing includes the technical putting together of the scene, things like making sure that all the layers are in the correct order, with overlays covering each other and your character at the correct position, as well as the environment elements that make the scene look good, such as shadows or textures that need to be added. You will use compositing to add character shading and highlights onto your character itself, environmental lighting effects that make the character fully part of the scene, and interactive lighting that affects the environment, such as shadows between the characters and the environment, or changing light sources, which again create different shadows depending on their location and if they're moving. You will also use effects that enhance your image, like color shifts, gradients, and textures that can't be drawn consistently by hand. This is usually more for the artistic looking types of animations, where you want to have textures within your brushes, or where you want to have a good gradients, which are not included in the Flip-a-Clip software. Depending on your software features, and especially on Procreate, you can take advantage of the artistic features in the software, such as using texture brushes, the glow, blur, and pixelation or chromatic aberration effects. There are many softwares that you can use for compositing on the computer. On the iPad, our options are more limited, especially since some effects require drawing new elements directly in the compositing software itself. So for this reason, I tend to use Procreate and some features in Flip-a-Clip because they allow me to have greater control on the look of each frame. And I will be explaining my thought process for when I composite and plan my compositing in the test frame, because this is the place where we get to be creative and inventive in our approaches to animation, depending on what compositing we want to have in each scene. You will need to make changes depending on your software limitations and the final looks that you want to give to your frames. So this is less about the technical aspects of what you can do with your software, and more about how you can find solutions to problems and push the boundaries of your softwares to create the look that you want. Up until now, we've seen pretty standard compositing. Basically, I only concern myself about the lighting, both the direct character lighting and the environmental lighting. But because we're using Procreate as our compositing software, we have many more options to get very creative with our compositing because we are using an illustration software and not a traditional compositing software. We have a lot more freedom and options for us to choose when it comes to artistic effects. But we also have many more limitations because of the layer limit and the fact that we have to add every single detail by hand for every single frame. This is where your test frame is really going to help you to get organized at the beginning, but for each effect and things that you're trying to make, you need to be very creative and test to see how you can get the effect that you want in the most efficient way. Here you see some examples of the compositing groups that I have to many of my animations. For example, you can see that simply by adding some texture to a very simple animation, I can give it more details and make it seem more artistic. By using the built-in brushes to give textures to the lines, and use a combination of texture brushes and clipping mask to give more details to the characters, I can create a more interesting effect. In some other examples, you can see that I can create very interesting lighting by using a combination of add, multiply, and overlay layers. This way I can play around with both saturation and brightness between different layers, which can really affect the glow of the environment in a much more interesting way than simply turning on the glow effect or the bloom effect in a traditional software. You can also see some examples of shots where I have more complicated compositing, where I have many different layers that create many different effects in different parts of the character animation. You can see it in the video of the woman with the transparent black dress, where different parts of the characters have lower opacity, and you can actually see the different layers, one behind the other. And this is without all the lighting and gradient layers that are made on top of each individual layer, and the additional lighting textures on the glowing parts as well. When you're having shots with a lot of compositing in them, you need to make sure that you actually have enough frames to create the entire effect that you're aiming for. And if you know that you have too many frames for the entire shot, maybe you should actually divide it between two different projects, and later edit them together to a single shot. Sometimes you'll have shots with interactive environmental lighting. This is where the lighting in the environment itself has to move, but you cannot physically draw them with the brushes in Flip-a-Clip. Or you might not be able to draw them with the brushes in Procreate as well. while keeping consistency. For this, you will have to use assets that we've made in advance in the test frames. You can see here with this C example that I have many different layers that compose the lighting in this scene. Some of them are hand-drawn and manipulated between individual frames in Procreate, and some of them are just assets that I copy and paste while moving them between frames. Again, same as before, you need to make sure that you have enough frames in your project to create all of the effects. If you can, it's a good idea to merge down your layers once you know that you've placed all of your compositing correctly, to make more room to more compositing with more layers. When you're adding your environmental lighting using either assets or hand-drawn parts, you need to make sure that they interact correctly with both the environment and your character. So, if you're using a copy-paste asset, you need to have a standard base that you place correctly on the environment, and then you can erase or change it in accordance to your character movement in any individual frame. You can see this here with this dragon example, where the amount of compositing layers on the environment changes depending on the presence of the dragon in the scene and its location. You can also see that the human character has different shadows between frames, depending on the dragon's location on the screen. In general, for each type of compositing that you're making, be it interactive lighting, complex compositing, or just simple compositing with a twist, you need to think about the overall look that you're aiming for and find the most efficient way to get to it. You will want to experiment and strike a balance between the limitation of your software, the look that you're aiming for, and the amount of work that it requires. My best advice about this is to time yourself when you're making the compositing of your test frame. This will allow you to estimate the actual amount of work and time that you're going to put into the compositing stage of your animation. This will also give you an estimation on the number of frames that your animation is going to take, because you know the number of frames in the actual animation of each shot, and you can multiply it by the amount of additional layers that you put into your test frames. Whenever you're trying to composite a scene, there are basically 3 lighting elements that you need to keep in mind. This is your character lighting, your background lighting, where your character interacts with it, and your environmental lighting. The easiest and most important one is your character lighting. If your animation is simple enough and doesn't require any specialized environmental elements, after adding your character lighting, you can basically finish your animation. Your character lighting is both the highlights and shading that you add to your character with either a hard or soft brush. This lighting basically exists to add to the volume of your character and put it firmly in the environment. This stage can be performed directly in Flip-a-Clip, and shading by itself can be enough to give your project a finished look if you do it correctly. By matching the lighting to the environment, we have both the twin goals of defining the volumes of your character and making it look a lot more like it's part of the environment. In animation, the shading is added to give a more 3D look to your character, so it will follow your character volume. You have to keep it consistent between frames, otherwise your movement will look messy and jittery. But to do that, we need to understand lighting itself. So there are two approaches to lighting an object in animation. First is adding shade, and the second is adding light, which is pretty self-explanatory. These approaches refer to the way that we choose where to place the lighting on the character. You can choose either one, or you can combine both of them to give your lighting a more complex and detailed look. But this will take more time and might need more compositing layers to complete, depending on your layer mode choice. So your approach will depend on your overall project, budget, and schedule. Each method will depend on the lighting in the scene. So when your scene is bright, it's more efficient to use the add shading method and just add shading to the bright base color. And when your scene is dark, it's more efficient to add lighting onto the dark base color. Basically, you need to make a distinction on where you will add less color to your character. If you already know that your entire character is going to be light and that the shaded area are going to be pretty small, then use the shading methods. But if you know that your entire character is going to be dark and the areas that are going to be hit by the light are pretty small, then just add light. If you know you're going to have a mid-range lighting, you can go with either one, or you can just add both of them at the same time. Because using the shade method gives you more definition to each individual part of your character volumes, because we're only going to shade the areas that are really close to each other. But the adding light method is better to define the overall volume of your character and the lighting sources in the environment. Since we already made the base color choice of character during the test frame stage, we can look at the color itself to know which approach we will be using. Basically, if your colors are dark, use the light method, and if your colors are light, use the shade method. First, we need to identify the light sources in the scene. This part is, again, already decided in the background and storyboard stages. From these sources, we find the angle from which the light hits the objects. Now, there are actually two types of lighting that can hit your character. First is direct lighting, which is when we're going to be using the hard brushes, because the light will directly affect the coloring of your character. And the second is soft lighting or bounce lighting. This is where lighting hits another object close to your character and reflects onto it. Usually, it will have an added color to it because it reflects a different object. So it wouldn't be the harsh and bright light that you're going to have with direct lighting. In these cases, we're going to have to use a different compositing layer to flip a clip because it does not have a very good gradient brush. In either case, you can have multiple light sources hitting your character at once. Some will be direct and some will be bounce lights. And this is why we plan them in advance using the test frames. After we know our light sources, the next stage is to find the volume of your character. Again, this was already done within the animation and cleanup stages if we done them correctly. By combining both the light direction and the volume of your character, we know which part of the character will be hit by the light. Basically, you just need to draw a line that follows the volume of your character, which is going to separate between the shade and the light area. When we're trying for the light adding approach, we will find where the light directly hits the character and add only small spots of light to give definition and separation from a dark environment, which is where the light source is directly behind the character. only illuminating its edges. When going for this method, the key thing to think about is to make sure that each volume and each part of your character is clearly seen. Because usually in scenes like this, you will have dark characters on dark backgrounds, and you want to make sure that they're not hidden within it. For the shade aiding approach, we try and find the areas where the light cannot hit at all. Basically, this will be mostly because of close overlapping of the character details. So this is a way to give localized volumes to layers that would otherwise look flat. Usually you're going to see this in areas such as your character's chins, armpits, and some clothing details, as a way to really give them definition. Again, if we done our character lines correctly, your characters are going to have volumes and definitions by themselves, but it does help to have this additional shading. And it can be essential if you're going for a lineless look. Now, if you understand your lighting situation and character volumes correctly, you can try adding the lighting directly onto your character drawings without using onion skin to check if its location and size are consistent. This can save quite a lot of time for your actual compositing process, as we're going to see later on. In these cases, I either just draw the lighting directly in Procreate using a clipping mask, like you are going to see, or sometimes I just use the line art layer, duplicate it, and add the lighting directly on top of it, later to be composited in Procreate, or by using the compositing layers in Flip-a-Clip. Make sure that when you created your test frames, you have your correct lighting, base colors, and highlight or shading colors. Because if one of them is incorrect, you're going to have a different effect than what you were planning for. Also, because Flip-a-Clip does not have all of the compositing layer features options that Procreate has, you need to make sure that you're choosing an option which actually exists if you want to composite it directly in Flip-a-Clip. For the next step in compositing, we will be moving to Procreate. This is where we're going to add our environmental lighting, our character bounce light, and interactive light elements. A lot of the times, for these elements, you will need some artistic looking brushes and object transformation features that does not exist in Flip-a-Clip. When composing in Procreate, we need to add every effect layer individually to every frame by hand. This can take quite a while, so having good organization and planning skills is important to make the process efficient. So whenever you're trying to plan your test frames, try and use the smallest amount of compositing layers that you can to get the effects that you want. And a lot of the time, to keep the task easier, you can even just directly import your lighting assets from your test frames as a layer group to your new project and just duplicate it and add the necessary layers to add your characters and environments into the frame. You can also take advantage of Flip-a-Clip with its in-software compositing features by just adding your assets as transparent images using the image import options directly in it, but in that case you wouldn't be able to use clipping mask, so your lighting and assets are going to affect the entire scene. It can still give you pretty results, but the effect is quite limited. The steps to actual compositing in Flip-a-Clip are actually quite simple. First, make sure that you have your line layer and your color layer separated. This will allow you to use the actual line layer as a base to block out your lighting details the same way that we've done with the coloring details in the last lesson. But don't use the actual line layer because you want to keep it clean and put it on top as to not damage the actual line art by coloring over it. So just duplicate your line art layer and set it to the correct layer blending mode for your lighting. This will be the layer we're going to use to add the lighting on top of your character. The order of your layers should be color on the bottom, lighting in the middle, and the line art on top. Once you have your layers set, save or screenshot the lighting reference from your test frames that we've made in the previous lesson. Then import it into Flip a Clip using the photo import feature and use the color picker to save the right colors for your blending mode. Now you have two options when creating your lighting in your lighting layer. First, you can use thin lines and just sketch the correct volume of your lighting right in your line art. This is very useful when trying to block out big shapes, because you will only need to block out the shape and not color each individual part of it by hand. You can use the bucket feature. But if you know that you have very thin lighting or very small areas that you need to add details to, you can also use the pressure brush to make things easier and more efficient. Be careful when using the pressure brush though, because it might take you a while to control it, and if you're trying to add small details closest to the edges of your character or your character body part, you might go over the lines. Here, you can see that by using the blending mode in Flip a Clip, you don't need to concern yourself with picking up the different colors for the shaded and light parts of your character coloring. And you don't need to worry about mismatching the lighting areas of the different colors. You won't be using different lines in different colors, which has to connect perfectly for your lighting effect, but only using one line which automatically transforms to the different colors. Honestly, this feature is the reason why I choose Flip a Clip as my main animation software in the iPad, even with its many drawbacks. In general, by having good organization and understanding of the features of your software, be it the ones that I'm demonstrating here or whichever software you're using, you can probably achieve products with much higher quality than you would anticipate by the price or quality of your software. I encourage you to try and test your software features and see if there are any ways that your organization can allow you to have more options when it comes to your creation process. Now that we finished adding the lighting to our animation in Flip a Clip, you want to prepare it for the exportation into Procreate for additional editing. Because we have a limit to how many layers we can have in our Procreate project, we might want to break down the animation into multiple smaller files. To do that, you can actually copy and paste your animation between different projects directly in Flip a Clip. By copying the entire frame in the actual frame window and then pasting them into a new project with the correct number of layers already open in the new project, You can exactly copy your frames into the new project with all of their layers and information, which makes it much easier to export the different layers that you need for the compositing in Procreate. Of course, you can finish the compositing stage already in FlipperClip if you're satisfied with the result, but there are some features that cannot be done in FlipperClip, and this is why we want to have additional compositing in Procreate. Also, some effects such as glow are not quite as flexible in FlipperClip like they are in Procreate. So, to composite using Procreate, first we need to import the video into it. I start by importing the base background layer as a video. This helps me make sure that I have all of the frames in the correct order when I open my file in Procreate. If you want to make the Procreate import in higher quality, you need to save the video as a file instead of to your album and import it into Procreate using the file options instead of the photo options. This will let you open the video as individual frames which will be represented by different layers, and they will be automatically numbered, so it's pretty easy to keep track on the correct order of your layers and to which layers you need to add which frame. So next, we'll import the different layers of your scene, such as your character layers or any additional lighting layers, separately into Procreate. By using the PNG export option, you will have a folder containing each frame as a separate image with transparent background in the correct order and also numbered. Now you just need to import the images into your scene in Procreate using the Add File option. By importing the background as video, you are going to have your layers automatically numbered, so it's really easy to match them together. The way Procreate treats each layer as a frame makes it so that you can't easily have multiple layers in a single frame, the same way that the layer features allow us to do in FlipperClip. Basically, if you want to have multiple different layers within each frames, you need to make the entire frame into a layer group. You can add additional details and effects to a specific layer in your group by using clipping mask. Otherwise, it's going to affect the entire frame the same way that FlipperClip does. It's very helpful when you want to add special lighting and coloring effects to your characters, because by duplicating your assets between groups, you can have consistent textures and effects. Also, by using the combination of layer groups and clipping mask, you can also take advantage of Procreate capabilities as an illustration software and add texture using brushes and features that are not normally seen in conventional animation softwares, such as the noise, chromatic aberration, and some texture filters that Procreate have. This is actually half of the reason why some of my animations look so unique. It's because the compositing elements themselves are not very common in the industry. Moving on to the actual environmental lighting, these are used to bring the elements of your shots together. So you want to add effects that change both of your character and the environment lighting. By using these types of connecting elements, you will create the illusion of the environment affecting everything in it equally. For these types of effects, I use layer modes which affect the line art or have effects with opacity, because changing the amount of contrast between the character elements themselves, such as your coloring and your lines and your details, gives them more depth and also makes it so that they really get into the environment, because the lines are affected in the same way as everything around them. You will also want to consider how the character being in the environment affects the environment itself. You will need to add shadows to the areas the characters interact with, or change your lighting situation if there are moving light sources in your scene. In these cases, you need to make sure that your lighting in the background itself is done on a separate layer, because you wouldn't want to have a duplication of your shading if your character is going from a light to shaded area. This is also where the selection transformation tool comes in handy, because in Procreate you have the option of transforming your selected elements on different planes, which allows you to use your consistent assets from your test frame and then shift them around the environment with the correct perspective, depending on where they are in the background. Of course, you can try and draw them correctly for each frame, but this is more difficult, and usually will have less consistent results. If you plan your test frames well, you will have all the elements that you need to have those changes. And this is why, when having scenes with interactive lighting, you need to have a blank and modified versions of your lighting assets, because they will be hard to duplicate between frames without having a base version. The last features, which are very useful to putting your character in the environment, are the glow and blur effects. These are under the category of modifications in the Procreate features. When using the modification effects in Procreate, be it the glow, color correction, or blur, take into consideration that they need to be consistent between frames. So basically, when you create your initial modification in the test frame, take note on the percentages by which you've adjusted your image, and use them for each frame in your actual compositing stage. Otherwise, the shifts between frames will be very noticeable and will create a lot of jittering effects. That being said, some effects don't affect your entire image equally. Some of them affect different areas of the screen depending on variations in the image itself, such as distance from the middle point. You can see this with chromatic aberration or perspective blur, and others depend on the contrast between the colors, such as bloom or curves. When there is a large change in your character movement that affects the application of the effect, you need to modify it to look better. But still, take note on the adjustment and try to keep them with as little change as possible between frames, because then you will still have flickering. Finally, this is the last exercise, and you simply need to just finish the animations that we've been working on. Make sure that you have the correct character and background design, as well as correct character movement, and that the animation is smooth and the characters are being kept on model. For this exercise, all you need to do is to match the lighting to your test frame to create the final product. Of course, the difficulty of this step is going to be determined by the test frames that you've made in the previous lesson. But if you see that you've added too many effects, you can just simplify your compositing stage to one element and practice only adding it. But of course, you would need to add all the elements to get to your final product as you envisioned it. To recap, today we learned how to add lighting to your characters by either adding lighting or shading to your character depending on the entire situation in the environment, as well as how to import your files between Procreate and Flip-a-Clip and add special effects to different layers of your frame. We learned about environmental lighting, interactive lighting, and character lighting, both direct and indirect. Finally, we learned how to apply some universal corrections using the modification tools in Procreate. And now we know how to make a complete animation from start to finish. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time for the conclusion. Bye!